Estamos aqui para dar voz ao povo, em defesa dos cidadãos, pela dignidade humana. Todos temos deveres, mas também todos temos direitos. Será que existe justiça? Isto é o povo a falar. Christiane Prange é uma professora alemã de Estratégia e Comércio Internacional em diversas universidades europeias e recentemente escreveu um livro onde tenta de uma forma detalhada que possamos conhecer a nova estratégia económica da China. Mas esse é um assunto que vamos falar um bocadinho mais adiante. Seria ótimo que eu pudesse falar português com a Christiane, mas não, a entrevista vai ter que ser feita em inglês, mas vamos fazer tudo para que você possa entender o assunto que vamos estar a falar. So, without further ado, good evening, and thank you so much, Christiane, for allowing us to interview you. We are going to talk about the book that you co-wrote with Andrew Caney, but first I would like to know how when do you cross paths with China?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. It was actually a long time ago when I was still working in France as a professor, and part of my research was on internationalization, the internationalization of companies. And I was very interested in Asia, in China, and at some point in time I told myself, how can you reasonably do research on China without having actually lived there? And then I crossed the path with a headhunter who called me and said, would you be interested in going to China? So it was just very instantaneously, and I said, yes, why not? And we met 2 weeks later, and 4 weeks later I had a contract, and then I went off to China for 6 years, working at Tongji University as a professor. And I have to say I really enjoyed it. It was a very different experience, obviously coming from Europe, but it brought a lot of experiences and insights into a very different culture.
And actually, what you were teaching there was also about business and international business, right?
Absolutely. So my focus is on international strategy and international business. And going to China, I was kind of shifting gears. So I was teaching Chinese people how to internationalize to Europe. And this is still kind of my hobby, I would even say, telling companies how to improve their internationalization processes between Europe and Asia.
Great. And as far as I'm concerned, it's completely impossible for me and probably for most of the Westerns to talk about Chinese economy right now without having a foreground of information that we can really try and make sense. So let me give you a few details, and we talk about this explosion of prosperity in China. 1979, the per capita GDP when Deng Xiaoping opened China was $404, and in 2022, $11,560 per capita a year. So this is an amazing growth. Another thing is that from 2001, it grew fivefold. So it's something that was never seen in the world. Another interesting fact is that 1979, with Deng Xiaoping, only 3% of the people would go above high school. Right now, almost 2/3 of all Chinese go into universities. China alone graduates more engineers than all the world combined. And finally, when we look, for instance, at robotization of some areas, it's possible in China to unload a full container ship in 45 minutes with full robots. It will take 48 hours in any other port in the world. How can this happen in such short time frame?
Well, you mentioned one really important point, and that is China's speed. And we see China's speed in nearly every part of the society, of the economy. If you just look back, as you mentioned, opening in 1979, it's such a short time in which a country made it to the top of the world. So it's a player on the international economic scene. So the speed of economic development is just marvelous. On the other hand, we see this in emerging market countries. There's the need, and I would even say the greed to have part of the cake. If you are very poor, your motivation is very different than coming from a Western country where you have everything, where you even turn to be a bit complacent. And we still see this in China. Everybody wants to have a better life. They want to have good education. They want to be a part of the world, which means they used to learn English very fast. Today, if we look at universities, the universities belong to the top of the world. So they're competing with Harvard. They're competing with IMD. They're
in terms of quality
with London Business School.
Amazing.
So obviously it depends on the subject. But if you look at top universities like Peking University or Tsinghua University, they produce some of the best graduates in the world. So that's definitely remarkable.
And when we look at this, we actually see a nation that was able to turn around a situation of starvation of their own people. But the truth is that the West doesn't have respect for what China was able to achieve, and created this idea that China is one of our enemies of old.
Well, I guess I would be a little bit more specific on that. A large majority of countries and people do admire for elevating people out of poverty. This is an achievement in itself that we have to respect and also admire. On the other hand, it's always a competition between nations. And if you look at America losing its forerunner position, obviously they are trying to fight for themselves. And it's always difficult to accept people and companies that are in strong competition. That's also a very natural tendency. On the other hand, we see there is no level playing field, so it's difficult for companies going to China, as it's difficult for Chinese companies coming to the West. So the question is, how do you find a balance where you support companies that internationalize and also work in such a large country like China? So going back to 1979, there was, we could say, a gold rush for Western companies going to China just because of the sheer scale of the market. And there were lots of government incentives. So we had specialized economic zones in Xiamen and in Zhuhai, a lot of tax relief that made it easy for Western companies to settle down. And we shouldn't neglect, actually, that there was also a very strong desire of consumers. Imagine that you mentioned the figures, they were extremely poor. So they wanted to have Western products. They wanted to have more, not even luxury, but going up the value chain to have a decent life. Now they want to have luxury, so it's going up and up and up, which is very natural.
Demanding consumers, they don't buy just anything. So, and now we come to this book that you co-wrote. The book is called Economics, and it has a type of a subtitle, which is actually what China's dual circulation strategy means for global business. But let's start. Why write this book and why now?
It started a bit more than a year ago when I was very interested still in China strategies, and I was also working on a concept that is called ambidexterity, so using different hands or using different cycles to combine something. And that was basically the point where I got in touch with Andrew Caney, my co-author. And he worked in China for more than 20 years in consulting. He's now the director of the UK National Committee on China. And just by chance, we met and said, hey, we are interested in China, let's do something. Originally, we were more focused on dual circulation, but then with the economy changing quite a bit, we were looking for a catchy title. And as economics was a term coined by the Communist Party itself, we thought that might be a good thing to use and put this as a title. And it's also a bit amazing because typically it should have been Leconomics, from the economics minister, but it shows the increasing intermingling between politics and economics, which is also one of the drivers for this book. And we just wanted to provide a help to translate sometimes rather dry policy documents into something that companies can use and derive guidelines for companies. So what can companies do if they want to go to China today? How can people better understand what is going on? And obviously you need to dig a lot deeper.
And we are going to talk about that strategy, mainly the four roles that we talked about and you present in one of the chapters. But let's start with the obvious. What is this dual circulation?
So dual circulation can be interpreted on different layers. So it's kind of a theory, it's a policy or a slogan. So on the theory level, it basically explains how do you split the economy into an internal and an external cycle. So focusing on the internal huge market, but also having the external market and some links between those two, which is kind of very important. On the other hand, it's also about policies or strategy. So strategy basically meaning making choices. And these choices are how much do you want to focus on China as itself, becoming probably more independent, self-reliant, and in how far do you want to focus on the external cycle? So China used to be a country that wanted to internationalize, to become part of the global scene, integrate itself. But now the question is, it's not, does it really only want to integrate itself, but also become part of this international business and even shaping the international landscape? So this is more the strategy side. And then obviously it also becomes a bit of a slogan, like many keywords like Belt and Road or Made in China 2025. So people use that as a cover term or a frame for a lot of other policies.
But let me this is where interviews with me start to be interesting. I'm sorry, because it's like this. They call it propaganda. So in the West, they call it propaganda, but we also have the Arab Spring, yes, we can. So we basically, in the West, do exactly the same things, but for us it's communication. When it's about China, it's propaganda.
Well, maybe we also need to go a bit deeper because the whole concept doesn't come from nowhere. It was backed by an economist, Justin Lin, who uses many different concepts from Keynes, from Adam Smith. So the whole structural economics is not something that comes out of the blue. It has some deeper roots. And we can be sure that everything that comes to the public in China has some meaning. So maybe it's a slogan, but it definitely has some deeper meaning of what is going on.
And has a structure so that it can be implemented.
So just to give you one example, we had an issue of cutting down the educational providers, especially when it comes to English. If you had read Xi Jinping's notes earlier on, you would have had an idea of what was going on and that he was trying to curtail some of those issues. So everything becomes much more obvious and clear if you follow very precisely the individual publications. But this is obviously, it is dry, it's difficult.
That is why the speeches of Xi Jinping are so important for us to get a hold, because normally it gives you a hint of what can happen. But if it is about economics or it's about something that will impact the economy, is it the economy minister that is going to implement?
Well, for this dual circulation, actually there is no specific ministry that is responsible because it's more like a frame that incorporates different parts of other concepts. So for instance, one important concept is common prosperity. Another concept is self-reliability. So all this comes kind of under the frame of dual circulation, and this covers different ministries and different responsibilities. But overall, it all aims at making China more independent and concentrating more on this huge internal market, which itself is a challenge.
Yeah, but obviously, because everything emanates from the party, how come these type of policies comport or have in itself other goals that the party may have, for instance, to enhance the quality of the products that are in national market.
So I would say there are two questions. One is, yes, the party is everywhere. It's east, west, north, south. The party is simply everywhere. And this is why China can also control the internal cycle much more than it can control the external cycle. The second part of the question, yes, of course, China wants to control its quality. So in the beginning, it was used as a factory of the world. So we all know that product coming from China was supposed to be cheap. Some of them still are. And it was good for Western companies to do their manufacturing there. But for every emerging market country, they want to move up the value chain. And they do not only want to export cheap products, they also want to produce high-quality products.
That's right. Some people say that we've changed from made in China into created in China. Where does self-reliance also and common prosperity go about here? Because many people think, oh, if we don't have a say, or if we don't have business with the global market, we cannot keep on growing in terms of common prosperity.
So common prosperity basically means that you want to level out a little bit the economic situation for individual people, but it's not the meaning of a welfare state like we have it here in the Western world. But if you look at some examples, so for instance, the private sector crackdown, we could even say, was partly initiated to reduce these tremendous gains that those companies were making and to put them more under the obligation to do something good for society. So common prosperity is obviously something that helps to further eradicate poverty, which is still there in some provinces.
We still remember when Jack Ma was called Baishi, because how can I say, the income of the company was not being also as felt by the workers and also by the society in itself. So in China, the growth of a company has to go along also with the quality of living of the Chinese people.
Absolutely. And one important issue is that if you want to increase the wealth of the population, you need to drive consumption. So not only rely on external or exporting, but somehow you need to make sure that the population has the money to spend and that it actually spends the money, which is a difficult point in time because there's uncertainty. And if you are uncertain, maybe you rather focus on your savings and you don't want to put it aside.
Good, it's true.
So that's very difficult. And more recently, there have even been initiatives, for instance, to curb tourism, that the entrance fees were reduced or even abandoned, just to make sure that there are more tourists using all the natural sightseeing sites. So there's some activities to drive these spending patterns.
Okay. According to this dual situation, there's a domestic economy, external economy. The implications are quite different in one and in the other. Can you explain us a little bit about that?
Sure. So for the internal cycle, what we mentioned before, the Chinese party has the control of what's happening inside. And it's a huge market that it wants to further elevate. For the external market, China still depends on Western markets. By the way, as much as Western markets depend on China, so for specific products, there's up to 90% dependence, for instance, if you look at rare earth that the West needs urgently. But also for China, for instance.
Solar panels also, like 75,
instance,
20%.
Solar panels, good point. And also for the semiconductor industry, up to now, China really depends on the West to have those critical components in order to produce their
just the 5G.
But they're making huge progress.
It's true.
And it will just take a few more years until China will be able to produce those products by themselves. But for the moment being, they also depend on the external cycle. They can't control.
And so that people may understand, right now the semiconductors if still affect China if they don't have that technology. But what will happen is that they maybe will not be able to export good cell phones, but what they have right now allows AI to control completely massive factories, like the Tesla one. So it's...
Yeah, for those sectors like semiconductors, AI, the Chinese really have an advantage because they were able to tinker around, to explore, to test, which is partly due to the non-existing data laws. So they could really use all the data available, and thereby they had a huge progress for autonomous driving and other types of AI-based activities. And in the West, we have very tight and strict laws that prevent the use of data. You can discuss what is good and what is bad. I don't want to go into that discussion, but at least that explains that China is quite far ahead in the AI sector.
Yes, because one of the things that, and I'm actually quite fresh from almost 3 weeks in China, one of the things that I did understand is that people, they allow their data to be collected. It's not that they, I got a problem because I'm here or I'm not there. I saw kids paying with the cell phones. I saw, how do you say, people that sell on the street fruit or whatever with the QR codes ready. Well,
yeah, in a sense, it's really amazing. So if you see a beggar on the street asking for money, they show you a QR code. Can you give me some money on my phone?
Code.
Which is amazing, and you can buy everything with the QR code to the extent that you don't even use any cash anymore.
The dual circulation also will have different impacts on state-owned companies and private companies. How can we understand, and what is the view that you have on this?
Yeah, so in the past we already had a restructuring of the state-owned sector, and as in many companies, state-owned sectors used to be less attractive to graduates because they were more stable and less dynamic. But we see that there's a resurge of people being interested in this sector because it's a stable career. But these state-owned companies, they're also forced to go international, and typically they didn't have the capability. So there's training, there's measures, there's support from the government to go international and train people. The private sector was a lot less regulated in the past. So we mentioned the AI, but also technological firms. And they used to be extremely interesting for young Chinese graduates. So the idea was a Steve Jobs of Asia. That was the ideal. And you could earn a lot of money in those companies, and you could build your own career around technology, so at the cutting edge. But this is changing a little bit now that we've seen since the IPO of Ant Group and Jack Ma that there should be more control. And by the way, this also applies to AI, that there's some line of control inserted. And what's interesting is that these controls actually come from the European Commission. So they do adopt some of those guidelines, and they see the dangers as well. So it's not a totally unregulated market anymore, but there is some convergence between the maybe over-regulated market in the West and the under or not regulated market in China.
Yeah, it's true, because one of the gentlemen that I had the pleasure to meet there and actually did a small interview, he said that we need to get a grip on AI because too much AI can actually be dangerous for any society, not just the Chinese. Regarding, obviously, the party and Xi Jinping, which is actually now the leader of the party, I guess, and the president of China. In a speech, he said that China must tighten international production chain dependence on China, forming powerful countermeasures and deterrent capabilities based on artificially cutting off supply to foreigners. But he didn't do that, but he did it a few weeks ago, after the European Union started also to promote next to European companies what we call the detachment also from China. So she was right in 2020. He saw before it happened, no?
Well, if you look at that statement, if you read that statement, it sounds very harsh at first. So like China wants to cut off the ties and curtail any supply chain relationships to the Western world. But on the other hand, there's more like a tit-for-tat strategy, and China obviously wants to be prepared for bans of specific products, for tariffs.
It wouldn't be the first time for them, right?
It wouldn't be the first time. And it's the same like for the US. They also prepare themselves if there's a shortage of specific products they can't get from China or can't export anymore to China. So all these issues of travel or of bans or tariffs affect the US and China equally. So you could also interpret this statement as some sort of a reaction to something that was before. So it's going kind of back and forth. The question, is this extending into a negative spiral, or will it stop? And so far we've been able to avoid a major trade war.
But Christiane, the interesting is that even if it happens, it will help the internal market of China. It will drive the internal market.
Right, that's true.
If European companies cannot come, if EU and the United States still ban or whatever, or don't allow more companies to buy things from China, it will drive their internal market.
Well, to a certain extent, if you look at the export figures, as you said, China still relies on its exports, so it would also negatively affect the country. It's more like a balance. So as we said before, China depends on the West and the West depends on China. If you cut off ties, I don't think it will benefit any party. So it's more like finding a way of getting away from the idea of decoupling and maybe even be careful about de-risking, but finding a way how to collaborate without ignoring the interest of one of the parties. And the West has many concerns. Some of them might be right, others not. But they cannot do without China, so there's a need to find a way how business and also politics can be done. And in politics you have always the issues, you like some aspects of your collaboration in diplomatic relations, but you don't like others. You are rivals in some aspects and you are collaborators in others.
Why is it so difficult for the Western to find this balance with China? Do you think it's because China overgrew the expectations?
I think this is a multi-layered question. So one is obviously whenever a country has such a huge advancement and such a quick development, maybe it turns into competitor. And companies naturally don't like competitors. That's one aspect.
Companies and nations.
And nations. Obviously, if you look at the US being number 1 for so many years, then there's the fear of China overcoming the US at some point in time, which will probably happen. Already has happened. On the other hand, it's a cultural issue. So I would say nobody understands China. People who say, I'm a China expert, I understand China, I don't believe that. Because
maybe that week.
You can understand that part, that tiny little part of China, but you cannot be a China expert, never.
And also because of the speed and the ability to adapt that you can find in Chinese society.
That's also one part. So China is uncertain. Uncertainty is a big characteristic of the market. And it seems like the Chinese, they have uncertainty in their DNA or uncertainty management in their DNA. So they find a way to shift around the problems. They're very pragmatic. They always find a solution. For Western people, it's more about clear linear strategy. They have a goal and they have a plan and they want to implement that plan. And if the plan changes, it puts them into an uncomfortable situation. And last but not least, we can't ignore that China also has a lot of problems on the international scene. So they're influencing or take influence in governmental organizations, which is not liked by all other countries. And they have a lot of internal problems that affect the way Western companies see what is just, what is right business, what is ethical business. And that's obviously one part that puts Western companies off.
But interestingly, although this decoupling is being promoted, for instance, you see Toyota last week made a deal with some Chinese brand. Volkswagen made a deal with a Chinese company also, because in a way, companies, they understand cooperation, and although they understand that in China the party is everywhere, ideology is everywhere, they also understand that business can be done despite the ideology.
Yeah, it sometimes seems that politics and economics are fighting against each other. Arguments might pertain different layers. So again, you could argue companies should be much more ethical. They shouldn't go to companies or to countries or regions that are blamed of violating human rights. They should just stay away. On the other hand, if you do that, if you don't go to countries that have corruption, you would probably never go to any country in the world.
Of course.
So that's always the balance. On the other hand, companies are collaborating, and if you just go back to our initial statement, 1979, the opening, I think VW and BMW, the automotive companies from Germany, they came to China, and the saying was in 1982 or 84, China will never be a market for cars. For the automotive sector, it will not be interesting.
And what we see today, everybody ride a bike.
And what we see today is that around 40% of the revenues of major car companies are coming from China. And they've been desperately trying to localize. So if we look at the car in China, we could say the car in China is typically an iPad on wheels.
That's true.
So, and this is what most companies haven't realized.
And I think that with the new Gigafactory from Tesla, China actually overtook Japan as the #1 maker of cars in the world. So this is obviously quite amazing. We already talked about the level playing field for foreign companies, but foreign companies also in your book you present that foreign companies can have 4 roles. Which roles are those?
So the most obvious role is probably that of the localizer. So these are companies that are producing in China for the Chinese market. And again, if you go back to the early years, the Chinese consumer was just interested in everything Western. But the Chinese consumers also developed, and they're becoming much more demanding in terms of quality, in terms of adaptation to the Chinese context. So the car is just one example. The car is full of technology. And it seems like many Western companies haven't realized that. Or if you look at beverage companies like Starbucks. Starbucks made a hell lot of money in China, but also they are adapting to the taste of Chinese consumers. Other examples are sportswear providers. Adidas had an excellent time in China, but today we have competitors like Anta or Li Ning that know exactly what the Chinese consumers want. And they deliver at a gargantuan speed.
Faster.
So you go into a shop, you buy your stuff, and before you reach home, you have the product at your home.
That's true.
So there's so much to learn about localization, which will be key for Western companies to survive in this specific type
So
strategy.
One of the roles, localizers.
Localizers.
The other one would be?
So another one would be exporters, companies exporting to China. These are typically companies that are too small to install themselves in the country, or that don't want to give all their technology to a production site. So examples are luxury companies, the German Mittelstand, the mid-sized companies that find a huge export market in China. We also have those companies that are known for their country of origin effect. So, for instance, champagne definitely comes from France. So everybody wants to have champagne from France. There's no need to localize.
Or wine from Portugal,
yeah,
please.
Wine from Portugal, exactly. So no need to localize. On the contrary, you want to have this as it is. So the exporters coming to China. Then we have the sourcers. So these typically used to be the ones that used China as a factory of the world. That was cheap for a long time. And they need to change as well because labor costs have increased enormously. So China is no longer cheap, not at all. They also need to upgrade their activities in China if they really want to source further. And we mentioned that before. It can be the case that innovation is coming from China. So we have this frugal innovation that is now coming from an emerging market country going into the world, which is becoming interesting. And then we have the separators, the last one. So these are typically companies in business areas that belong to critical areas. So for instance, aviation, telecommunications, where you have off limits to produce in that market. And what is interesting, companies normally have all those 4 strategies in their portfolio.
Yes.
So some parts are off limits, others are okay, some are produced in China, some are produced outside of China. And the challenge is how you orchestrate this portfolio.
But somehow this helps to, well, the model is useful, but at the end, we can all learn that a company must be able to adapt itself as it goes along in a Chinese market, because what it is today, it may change tomorrow. So how important it is to have, for instance, a Chinese associate?
So we were talking in the book also about the term agility, how you can react speedily, how you can adapt, how you can circumvent uncertainty. And for many of the strategies, it is absolutely vital to have local counterparts. There are some people in the West that speak fluent Chinese, that have Chinese experience, but if you are not deeply embedded in the Guanxi network, you will not really understand what is going on, and you need those people as an ear to the market and also as an ear to the policy guidelines of the Chinese Communist Party to know what is right, what is not right, and this can change very instantaneously. So navigating uncertainty, being agile, being able to change strategies, and also mentally being able to adapt is very, very important.
And when you say mentally able to adapt, you mean understanding also Chinese culture, for instance?
Definitely. What I also have in mind is the idea of how do you make a plan, or how do you make a strategy. And the typical Western idea is you have a plan
and you stick by it.
You stick to that plan, and then you implement that plan even if it takes 5 years. But this doesn't work anymore. So you can have a plan, but you will see that maybe tomorrow it just doesn't work, and you need to adapt that plan to the reality and see how you can change it.
Actually, it's interesting that you say that, this, because even the party has no problem stopping a policy that they asked to implement, but they then see that doesn't work. This pragmatism, it's really, it's a challenge for us as Westerners.
China in many aspects is really pragmatic, but we should never forget there's an overall plan. And this is clear, so it's very clear where China wants to be in 1949 at specific points in time. So there's no way of actually questioning those this overall plan. But levels below that, you have hundreds of policy guidelines, you have changes, you have adaptations, and these can be changed from day to day. Sometimes we don't even know exactly what is valid. So even for lawyers working in the country, it's sometimes difficult to understand what's the law that is relevant today and tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned this, because one of the things that we saw, for instance, in 2021 as a whole, is the implementation of regulation in the market. So China started to do what many Western countries already did, was to create some administrative departments that regulate the market, control quality. They even had a very saddened situation, I think, in 2020 regarding the milk, that was found a particular plastic on some milk brands. So she and the party and the Chinese government is looking into regulate the market seriously.
Definitely. So if you mention the food market, this has been a huge issue to the extent that the local population completely avoided local products. I mean, that can be easily understood. If you buy baby food or food for your family and there's a risk that this is contaminated, you just avoid that and you turn towards Western products because you know that they are safe. And we still see this in the food market today, that rich people tend to buy Western food. But the more you want to actually drive the local market, the more you need to make sure that those products are competitive. And this is again a very natural tendency that you elevate the quality of local products. If you look at areas that are less critical, for instance, fashion. So again, we had fashion coming from the West that was pretty amazing in the beginning. But today we have brands, Chinese local brands that are preferred by Chinese people. And there's a return going back to localness.
Do you think that this type of how can I say, For instance, the antitrust agency, the market regulation administration. It's also showing all the world, hey, we are also implementing what you had before. So please take us in consideration, because we are not just anyone in the world.
Well, this is what China always says. We are not just anyone in the world. We want to be an equal partner. And our economic figures actually justify that we are an equal partner already. I think what's behind is the question, how do they present themselves on the global scene? So we see still many variations in communications. We see some activities that we can't understand. So we had the issue with Hu Jintao, now with the foreign minister. So these are things that, in my opinion, are not really necessary, and they're even counterproductive in creating trust. So the question is why? Why does China need that? I don't have a real answer to that, but I think China could be doing much better in communication. Or I would even say there's some message behind that, because normally they know what they're doing and they deliberately want to keep it this opaque.
But let us stay here for just a couple of minutes, because one of the things that I've learned is that it's not anyone that is part of the party. Actually, to be part of the party, there are standards, and there are certain types of behavior that you must have, that are the standards that you must achieve. So for us, this looks like very, well, what is this, old-fashioned or whatever. But then when we look at Western politicians, some of them should have gone to better schools, or finished school at least, to be entrusted with such responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can definitely say that the Communist Party is like a fiefdom in itself, where access is extremely difficult, and it's based on meritocracy. So you need to be highly qualified, not only from your education, but also ideologically to be part of that. And you're right, if we compare this to Western governments, everybody can join politics, and typically those people that are less qualified join politics, which is very different. On the other hand, the Communist Party is certainly opaque and not accessible to external people, not from the West, but not even for people inside China. So a lot that is happening cannot be explained, and you see that with many speculations. Whenever there's something that is out of order, there's huge speculations, and nobody really knows what is going on. It can be that there's...
it was necessary to do something, but we never know.
Is there a message to the West? Were people really ill? Is it some sort of punishment? So we don't really know.
Do you think... I'm going to be a little bit provocative. Do you think that something like what's happening with Hunter Biden could happen in China with one of the sons of President?
Well, I think they would have taken action much earlier. So that's what they typically do, and we just saw this with the foreign minister. So whenever such behavior occurs, normally people disappear. I mean, this is not certainly not what we would wish for in the West.
I'm smiling because it's... but the disappearance doesn't mean that people are killed. They just disappear from sight, maybe even with contact with family. This is something that China should try and handle.
Well, you never know what happens to people who disappear. First of all, you don't know where to they disappear. So Jack Ma disappeared. Even Xi Jinping disappeared shortly for a week or so, and nobody knew exactly what was happening. Business people disappeared, and in some cases it can be serious, so they are put into prison. So the thing is, we don't know. We don't know the reason, and we don't know what happens to them. And many went into exile. So that's certainly a critical situation, and it doesn't help to create more trust in China. And I sometimes wonder what the message behind that is, especially because there could have been other options to communicate.
Of course. When we go back at the dual circulation, do you think this, although may work for China, the message that sends to the outside is that it's hers and them, with the focus on the internal market and the external market, being secondarized, although still being important?
Well, yes, certainly. So I remember when the keyword dual circulation popped up, and I had this idea of writing a book. Many people said, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's too critical. But actually, it's a very normal development, again, if you look at emerging market countries, that after periods of initial growth, where they focus on building up their economy, and they sell to other countries, predominantly cheap products, and they elevate their value chain, they're trying to sell more expensive products, and then they focus on building up their own economy. So that's not really surprising. Also, to become independent is not really surprising. Many countries are doing that. What may be critical for Western people to understand is how does this link between internal and external really work. So China is not cutting off its ties from the external world. It cannot do that, and it will not do that. So the external cycle is important, especially for products that China needs. So the challenge is to remain attractive for China, and we've seen this in some sectors where the Chinese have become better. So if the Chinese are better, why should they use external products? If there's a need for products, obviously companies are invited to come to China, and they have a red tape, so they get everything.
Well, one of the things that companies that go into China need to know is that their know-how, it's supposed also to help the people. Meaning it's not just selling and making a ton of money, it's also to promote better standards of life.
Absolutely, but you touch a critical issue. So bringing know-how into China also means that it is accessible to Chinese companies, and Chinese, from their cultural tradition, they're very good at imitating, or you might say negatively copying, and putting new parts into what they find.
I don't know.
And developing
was it different
further.
In Japan?
I guess no.
Was it different in Japan? If you look back, it
I guess no.
that different.
Maybe the speed is different.
Maybe the speed. We are in our final 3 minutes. And Christiane, in your final chapter, you talk about the outlook for multinational corporations in China. Can you share your findings with us?
So my major point is probably if companies want to succeed in China, they need to update their own capabilities. They need to speed up to remain attractive to the Chinese market, because if they don't do so, the Chinese firms will do that at tremendous speed. If I look at the automotive industry, it's at crossroads, and if they don't change their strategies, they will have a difficult time. They cannot do without China, but if they don't update, they will not be able to do in China.
But I think even here the party has already said, give us a hint, because they have this communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, which means that if I am a car builder, I'm a car builder but with Chinese characteristics, right? Do you think this is a hint for you if you want to create something, if you want to put your brand and your product in China?
Maybe, yeah, we see that. What could be really important to think about is how will the world look like in a couple of years, and I don't think it's an option to think about decoupling or de-risking. There needs to be a way to collaborate with each other, and there needs to be a way not to interfere too much. We are not in the position to educate China, and China is not in the position to tell us what to do. So we need to increase our own reliability. We need to emphasize what is important for us, formulate the red lines, but also accept that others are different.
And from that difference, maybe we can start and build the bridges that even Xi Jinping has talked about in some of his speeches. Christiane Prange, thank you so much for being here with us and presenting this Chiconomics book that you wrote also with Andrew Caney. Wish you all the best. You can find this book online, for instance, and maybe get a glimpse of it and read and learn about more the economic situation in China. Thank you so
much for having me.
E obrigado a si que nos acompanhou em mais um programa. Quero lhe dizer também que não é só sexta-feira, é também o último dia antes das nossas férias, sendo que o Isto é o Povo a Falar vai estar de férias até dia 28 de agosto. A 28 de agosto voltamos a estar no ar, mas vai ser com repetições. Alguns dos programas que nós escolhemos desde o início do ano até agora, e voltamos sim a estar consigo com novos programas no dia 11 de setembro. Resta-me agradecer e dizer que não se esqueça de ir até às redes sociais e dar-nos o seu apoio. Muito obrigado por estar aqui connosco a cada dia e desejo, caso seja caso disso, umas boas férias. Obrigado.